Hi everyone, thanks for joining ImageFast today to talk about SharePoint Governance. It'll be myself, Holly Murphy, that will be taking you through the agenda quickly, and then it'll be Mark Ober, Pre-Sales Consultant of ImageFast, who will be taking you through the overview of SharePoint Governance as a whole. So, moving on to the agenda. We're going to have a short introduction about ImageFast. We're just going to tell you a bit about ourselves, and then we're going to move on to governance as a whole, so understanding what it is and why it's important. Mark will then move on to SharePoint Governance as a whole, and then we'll discuss a bit about how ImageFast can help you, and also additional collateral that we have for you and we can send you. So I'm going to pass you over to Mark now.
Thank you very much, Holly. Welcome again, everybody, and thank you for joining us on this short webinar. Before we go any further, I'd just love to introduce ImageFast. ImageFast is an award-winning consultant and technical service company. We're based in the London City, EC1 area, and we help our customers supply information management solutions, and we do this in both commercial and public sectors to both clients large and of small sizes, to help them get to a stage where they can capture, control and collaborate their information. ImageFast, we have 16 years industry experience, and we don't only help provide solutions, but we also offer an end-to-end design, implementation and support service. In our case, we'll be discussing SharePoint as our business platform, and our governance piece will be in respect of this. If we then take a look at the subject of governance as a whole, governance, simply put, as you can see on screen, is a set of policies, roles, responsibilities and processes. These are, again, simplified to be said as the same thing which directs and controls how an organization works with IT to achieve business goals. So what governance's main objective do is align business and the IT needs together so they form one goal. If we go back and talk about why governance is important, so we've spoken about what it is, and now we want to go back and say, why is governance important? Why do I care? There was a time when, to many, IT in a business or in a company meant a group of people who worked on a bunch of code, sat downstairs in cold, dingy offices at the bottom of a building, perhaps in the basement, behind closed doors, and these people were generally seen as not very people-facing and were concerned with sitting in front of a computer all day. This used to be a very typical image and stigma in time past, and in some cases it's still one that comes to people's mind first. However, in recent times, we've seen just how much this has changed, where IT now in many organizations has now become a very key, critical, integrated component with the business overall. So we're not just talking about the equipment, we're actually now talking about the processes. As IT has grown and developed, our processes have become a lot more motivated and a lot more IT driven. So when it comes to governance, the idea and key here is to get the balance right. So this is aligning our business needs with our IT needs. In terms of ImageFast, we have found that most current IT environments, including SharePoint, are so involved with the business that they need regulatory compliance, cost control, availability, risk management, and most importantly, again, the alignment with business. And for this to be the case, you have to have good governance. So in terms of having successful application and implementation of a governance plan, we're going to have a look at some principles that you can provide as a mechanism to help guide, direct, and control how an organization's business divisions and IT teams can cooperate to ensure that they meet both the business objectives and IT objectives. In this case, it's not always very easy because we find ourselves in environments that are increasingly changing. And a good example is in a day-to-day environment where our business needs are changing at a much higher demand than our IT needs. If we then go on now to look at the key elements of what we call a successful governance plan. In our humble opinion, we've managed to summarize these down into 4 main areas. The first one being people. So of course, any governance plan is driven by the people, so the people who will work with, towards, and as part of a governance plan. The policies then, which make up the governance plan, so these are the rules, regulations. The processes, which drive the policy, which again is what the people have to follow. And then finally, the technology. So this is the actual physical element which there needs to be a process for, which is governed by policy, which the people use. So in our case, we'll be discussing this remit against SharePoint. If we then go on to look at this a little bit more in depth at a high level, when we say people in respect to the roles they play and the tasks they will perform. So if in my respect, I have a SharePoint system, how will my users use this system? What manner would they use the system? So for example, if my users from HR, would they be using it in a HR perspective, or would they be using it from perhaps a day-to-day account perspective? And it's at this point you want to start off your governance plan by defining your different groups of people and the tasks they will do and how you expect them to do it within your respective system, in our case SharePoint, and how then the other elements, which we're going to speak about briefly, take apart. So if we then went on to look at policy, for example, so we have our people set up now as part of our initial key elements which make up our governance plan. We have our people and their tasks and their roles and their responsibilities defined. For example, HR will save HR documents. These particular documents are going to be sensitive documents. So for that reason, we then have to go on to define some policies. So again, our policies here are our rules and our guidelines. So this is what we expect our users, or if we go back a slide, our people, to meet without fail or risk of penalty to the business. So again, my example there was HR. We don't want a situation where perhaps somebody is using the system incorrectly because there is no rules or guidelines set up, and they make somebody's personal information available to the whole company, which then results in the company breaching a rule or guidelines set in its industry. Again, as HR as an example, perhaps somebody's private information gets leaked out, and as a result, Data Protection Act has been breached. So we want to align our business now, policy, rules and guidelines, along with what we're going to use for our systems, or in our case, SharePoint. So we want to take those rules and guidelines and make them part of our IT system. By doing so, we're going to make it part of our governance plan. Following that, once we have our rules and our people, so we know who's doing what, we have clearly defined roles, we know which rules and guidelines they need to be following. Of course, we need to set up the processes to make sure they follow those rules, which brings us on to processes. So as a short summary, or a good way of captioning this in terms of governance, processes are friendly guidance provided to users to help them correctly follow the right policies, and perhaps in our case, processes. So yes, I'm in HR. Yes, I'm using SharePoint to save employee details. Yes, I know these details have to be kept in a secure manner. Yes, I know a certain amount of time. I can then go on to define this process. So I can say, as part of my governance, if a document is older than 7 years, which may perhaps be the Data Protection Act law, said document is deleted, or perhaps after 2 years it's moved to a separate area, even more secured, or as part of an employee, a worker from HR saving a document into the HR area of my system in SharePoint, a certain type of security is applied. So what this does is help lock my document down to ensure I adhere to a process which has been set up to make sure I adhere to a guideline or rule. The reason being is, like many other technologies, SharePoint tends to challenge and asks users to work differently. It asks users to change their habits and the ways that has an overall objective to improve the current state of an organization. So yes, SharePoint can be used at an enterprise level for document management, collaboration, as an intranet system, but because of this we have to have some processes in place to make sure we're getting our users to work in the correct way. Which brings us finally on to technology. in our case being our SharePoint platform. So once we have our processes and our policies and our people defined, of course, we need to make sure we can get that against the technology which we're trying to govern. So we then take our processes which say we have to keep documents for 7 years, and after 7 years we must delete them. Perhaps after 2 years we have to move them to a record management store, and this is part of our process because there's rules and guidelines within our industry that say information of this type has to be handled in that way, and it needs to be done by a certain type of person or people, in our case being a user from the HR team. We then want to go on to apply it to our technology. So in turn, our technology will overall deliver good governance. If we go on then to discuss how we can take that information and put that into a governance plan, we can generally break these down into 4 areas, which is what we call our what you need to know areas. These can be broken down into 4 steps, the first step being the foundation activities, followed by the structure of the plan, followed by the development of the plan, and of course finally the deployment of the plan. A key thing to just emphasize here is a governance plan is not something you do once and you forget about. It's something that is a cycle, and you do constantly and continually as, again, the business needs change, as the IT needs change. You want to make sure you're keeping your governance plans refreshed, your policies checked, your guidelines checked, the people and how they work checked. So although we've broken these down into 4 steps, these are not 4 steps that you do and you forget about, which is a very common mistake people do. They do their governance plan once and they have the belief that that's going to see them through. Good governance plans should always be re-looked at, should be recapped, redeveloped. If we go on to look at some of the steps, our first steps as identified, what we call our foundation activities. So overall, this can be summed up as our information gathering step. So this is where, as part of our plan, we work out any considerations. And a good way to do this is to set up high-level workshops and meetings with stakeholders who will be using the system. So where we have a SharePoint as a platform and we've got HR who will be using this and perhaps account, it's those key stakeholders you want to sit down with and agree to them or with them what governance means to the organization, so that together you can identify key areas of the policies and compliance which will need to be considered so that the right processes are put in place. A good way of doing this is perhaps setting up a governance committee, so perhaps one person from each of those relevant departments as key stakeholders. That way they can define the scope of any projects and agree how they will be conducted. So at this point we don't want to talk about nothing to do with solution or technologies. For example, we would like something that allows us to delete documents after 7 years. No, we want to be able to say our process is after 7 years this needs to be deleted. So it's more of a definition as opposed to our want versus technology need. From here is also where you go on to develop your timelines, your scopes, so that way you can ensure your governance plan is complete in time for any project that may come out of it as a result. So in our case it might be our SharePoint environment. You also want to use this opportunity to define what the overall plan will cover. So what kind of format is it going to be in, and who will own it moving forward. And again, using a governance committee where possible, where viable, where you can have people to be involved with the definition creation and any ongoing maintenance and communication of the plan helps. Again, personally, from some of the experiences I've seen, these stakeholders tend to be people who are involved with the project, people who are stakeholders of the actual system or perhaps technology that may be used, those from the admin team. It can be anything from a range. If we then go on to look at our second step, which is the structure of the plan. So what we're doing now is we're taking all the information we've gathered in step 1, and we're then going on to start structuring how we want our plan to look. If you've done step 1 correctly, or you've fulfilled some of the key considerations and gathered the information at a point where you're comfortable to move on, the second step, which is our structure of a plan, generally falls into place. It's usually here where you begin to architect your governance and how you want it to be managed. It's here where the governance plan can then go on to be looked at in terms of the technology you want to use. So perhaps we can talk about security and types of content. So this is where you begin to take the considerations you had before and now begin to apply some of the technology elements to it. So using my HR example, I can say the type of document I'm going to be saving, if we do have a system, is going to be quite sensitive. So if possible, I need this to have some sort of classification that marks it as sensitive so that the relevant security can be applied to it. I also need a way for this information to be architected. Because I have already done the information gathering and I've got this information from my governance committee or perhaps my key stakeholders, my plan falls together quite easy and very efficiently into place, which will then allow me to define my headings, which will push me on to my step 3, which is developing my plan. In terms of developing the plan, all you're doing now is building on the information you've gathered in step 1 and 2. So I know I need to save this type of document. I know it's sensitive. I know based on policy it needs to be kept for 7 years. Perhaps after 2 years move to record management. I know based on some of the structure I've been looking at step 2, this type of document is going to be classified as sensitive. It's going to need a lot of security. So I can then go on to put this into my plan. I can organize and prioritize my requirements. So as well as technical, as well as service management. So in terms of, okay, because this information is sensitive, because this information is going to be locked down, I need to be able to ensure it's locked down in a way that I'm happy with and I can confidently go forward with to my compliance team. I also want to be able to say, if I need that information given back to me within a certain amount of time, so this is our service management, that information is given to me. I need SharePoint to be up perhaps 100%, although that's impossible, but say 97% of the time because this information is critical to my job. So any time, for every moment SharePoint's down or my platform's down, it's affecting me. And it's at these stages, because I've done my considerations at step 1 and because I've spoke about some of the technical aspects of what I required in step 2, this all begins to take form and come about in my development of the plan. I'm looking on screen and you can see some of the key highlights I've got here is you want to make sure your plan is understandable. So not only should the business team be able to read and understand, likewise the IT team should be able to understand. In fact, somebody coming outside of the business should be able to read your governance plan and see logically why perhaps a document needs to be restored within 7 hours if a system goes down, or why perhaps a HR document needs to be locked down as tight as it is. Finally, a very important step is to ensure that the plan is fully reviewed before being deployed. That a lot of plan they face after reaching this stage, not being able to get the deployment of the plan correct, which brings me on to step 4, deployment of our governance plan. So at this point, you want to make sure any solution training is in place. You want to make sure once the plan has been successfully deployed, that there's a review of the plan in place. So like I said, when we first started looking at the governance plan, although it can be broken down into 4 steps, some people can even break it down as far as 10 steps, those steps aren't definite, they're more infinitive in that you want to keep reviewing them, you want to keep going through them. We've seen some examples where people do this annually, some people do it quarterly, some people do it an even longer period, but the idea is after you've deployed it, you still want to be able to look at your plan and go back to step 1 to make sure all your considerations are still up to date, all your information architecture and your structure of your plan is still up to date, to make sure the plan doesn't need any more development. SharePoint governance itself as a key component is what will determine how your SharePoint environment will run. Not only will it determine how it will run, it will also determine who will do it and what equipment will be used. I mean, SharePoint's power and ease of use has made it one of the hottest selling pieces of software to hit the market currently. This success has led to Microsoft's CEO, Steve, to talk about as a company operating system. So it's got quite a buzz within the industry, within users, and a lot of people rush to get the next big thing without perhaps taking some of the steps I've just described before to make sure there's a clear indication to any accountability to the quality of their systems, any perhaps restrictions they may need to put in place. Another big key issue is proliferation. So here we're talking about the rapid growth of data. SharePoint's quite hungry in that it takes whatever you feed it. So if we're feeding it all this documents, so in our example again, HR information, have we put things in place to make sure our system can handle the growth of documents? If we started or onboarded 15 new employees, would we be able to save all their details into SharePoint without having any issues? Are we able to find the information once we've got it stored? How about our content lifecycle? So again, is our information being kept for the time it needs to be and deleted for the time it's not? Having our governance plan is where all of these areas come into place. They're defined, they're talked about, and they're structured. I like to refer to it as a how-to guide, which will, for me personally, from what I've seen, from my experiences, from what ImageFast as a company have seen, goes on to increase SharePoint adoption for users and the way they use SharePoint. So for a lot of users, once they know this is how I should save a document, this is what happens when I need to find it, this is why it's locked down, there's a lot less fail rate in terms of your adoption. For a user who perhaps doesn't know why a document's being locked, he's raising a lot of calls to the service desk, or he doesn't know why a document's being moved, or why he doesn't have permission, it puts him off using the particular system. In our case, that would be SharePoint. Once he's put off, he grumbles about it, he moans with his colleague or somebody else, and it brings down the overall adoption. Whereas if you have a good governance plan in place, which has been correctly communicated, users understand why SharePoint behaves the way it does, and they understand why they have to work the way they do. Just to round up, I just wanted to hit up on some more few key elements for why ImageFast believe very strongly in having the SharePoint plan, governance plan, is summarized in these 5 points. The first one being people who have SharePoint and perhaps don't have a governance plan in place tend to suffer from a lack of compliance. So like I said, where you have a poor governance plan or a non-existent governance plan, HR documents are being saved in the wrong areas, or perhaps the right security is not being applied because somebody never thought of it as a consideration. So our people, although they know the policy, so this is our rule and our guideline, are not following the right process in regards to the technology. So again, those are the 4 elements I spoke about before. Documents are being saved in the wrong area for the other users to access. Should said company get audited, you'd have a breach, both in an internal view and in a more industry perspective. So perhaps where financial information is concerned, you could see yourself finding yourself paying quite big fines. You also have a higher total cost ownership, so people don't know who owns what, and everybody's blaming the guys downstairs in the basement. So the IT guy says, oh, IT should know better, and IT is saying, we did what you told us to do, because there's no true balance. Everybody's pointing fingers at each other. Whereas on the flip side, when you do have a governance plan, your risk of compliance tends to be a lot lower because you have processes which are built in place using the technology. And as a result, there's a lower risk to incurring fines, and of course there is a much more vivid and defined total cost ownership. Again, this is only a very high-level summary of ImageFast point of view on a governance plan and some key elements. We do have some white papers and data sheets which you can kindly request, which talks about it in a lot more steps, and we'll walk you through the process. ImageFast as a consultancy also offer the services to help you not only at step 1, which is you're deciding what you want to do, but right down to your deployment stage, almost as far as going on to recommend solutions we have helped other customers put in place, such as the AvePoint SharePoint Governance suite of tools, DocAv6, which can help you execute your governance plan once you get it in place. I mean, it's one thing to have a plan, but it's another thing to get it executed correctly. So ImageFast don't only give advice, we can also help in this respect. And that, again, that's at any stage, be it at the beginning, the review, or the technology stage. At this point, I would like to kindly hand over back to Holly, who will talk a little bit more on how ImageFast can help.
Thanks, Mark. So thanks again for attending today's webinar. Just to highlight quickly what Mark just mentioned, how ImageFast would like to help is we'd like to spend some time with your team, and we'd like to establish where you are right now and where you should be heading really. And as Mark mentioned, we do have some reading material, such as the SharePoint for ECM blueprint. We've also got the SharePoint Governance white paper soon to be released, and you can request that via our website, which is www.imagefast.co.uk. Or if you'd like to have a chat and you'd like a demo of the SharePoint Governance solution, you can email us at marketing@imagefast.co.uk. Thanks again for attending.